Hello, everybody. We're going to give folks one more minute to show up. Just a couple logistical items. There is a chat in the sidebar, so as you have questions during the session, feel free to ask them. I will do my best to be paying attention to that as we go through it, but we'll also have time for questions at the very end. This is being recorded, so if you do need to hop off early, feel free to do so. I'll share the recording with you afterwards. I'll also share the slides. For those of you who know me, we have an awful lot of slides to go through. So we will fly, but I will share that with you afterwards as well. So hopefully that will be helpful for you. Last item too, as we go through this, if you have suggestions on how I can make these more helpful for you or improve the next one, I am very open to that feedback. So please feel free to share that. You can DM me. I know most of you found out about this through LinkedIn, so you can just send me a DM and let me know how awful it was or whatever. If you have constructive feedback, that would be great. Always looking to improve. So I think we can go ahead and get started. Today's topic is how to design proprietary consulting frameworks. And this is a topic that I've been interested in for a long time. I think it's one of the better tools that you have in your consulting toolkit. So I'm looking forward to walking you through that. Quick intro of myself. My name is Sean. If you don't know me, I'm the CEO of Madison. Previously, I was a founding partner at Manifold, which is a venture holding company in Chicago. I was there for 12 years with two other partners. Had about a team of about 70 folks. And then for 9 years, I was a professor at Kellogg teaching digital marketing as well. And as I mentioned, I am a self-professed framework nerd. Madison is an organization helping professional services firms grow, primarily by making their revenue-generating professionals slightly famous. And we do that by helping you clarify your point of view, if you haven't already. We turn those ideas into compelling authority marketing content. The framework piece is a piece of that. And then the goal is over time to transform your team into trusted advisors that prospective clients admire and respect. And then we design respectful, thoughtful ways that are not pushy for prospects to potentially raise their hands when they're ready. So that's Madison. And just to walk you through kind of how I see the world of professional services, and specifically, I'm talking about boutique professional service firms here, but I do think there's a lot of parallels with larger firms as well. If our goal is to grow a professional services firm, I think there's three main problems that I've identified. One is lack of awareness of the organization, of what it is that we do. Another is weak pipeline, so not enough leads or not enough people that we're kind of writing proposals for, kind of working that pipeline. And then on the back end, subpar delivery, which has impacts in terms of the numbers of referrals you generate and things like that, upsells, lengthening client engagements, all of that kind of thing. So how do we solve for that? There's three key pieces: attract, convert, and deliver. So attract, we clarify your point of view. We try to codify aspects of that point of view into compelling frameworks. We then translate that into authority marketing content. Our focus is on short form, and we can talk about why that is, either during Q&A or offline. We then try to convert that through high impact workshops. Here you are, creating perfect proposals and then nurturing relationships over time. And then once someone raises their hand and says, hey, I want to work together, we nail client onboarding. We manage accounts very, very well. I've learned over time, in some ways the hard way, that the way that you manage the account is at least as important, if not more important, than the work itself. And then designing systems to get referrals on a predictable and regular basis. So today, what Madison focuses our energy on these days, it's early days in the business, as most of you know. We focus most of our energy on identifying this point of view, communicating it through authority marketing, and then delivering high impact workshops. But today we're going to be talking about framework design and how do you codify that. That's something that sometimes we help people with, but often it's something that you can do yourself. And my goal is to walk you through exactly how we would go about doing that. As you all know, one of my ideas is to give away all your secrets. And so I'm not going to hold anything back in terms of how I would go about doing this. So hopefully you'll know how to do it yourself. As I mentioned at the very beginning, if you have questions in the sidebar, feel free to drop them in. I'll do my best to pay attention and answer them for you. But let's get into it. So frameworks. I think most people are familiar with what frameworks are, or at least you know one when you see one. Some of the more established, successful, reputable, especially management consulting firms have done a really good job of this. The BCG Matrix, folks are probably familiar with that in terms of identifying your product portfolio and make, the strategies for, what buckets go where are we underrepresented, that kind of thing. You probably learned that if you're an MBA student, you learn that in business school, certainly. Similarly, McKinsey is very famous for their 7S strategy framework. Michael Porter created the value chain model. It's a great way to kind of gain visibility and to kind of position yourself again as a trusted advisor. My first exposure to this was through a guy named Craig Wortman. He is a professor at Kellogg. He teaches entrepreneurial sales. But he wrote a book called What's Your Story? And one of his key insights that, in his opinion, unlocked a lot of the opportunities for him, both from a consulting standpoint and ultimately kind of paving the way to become a professor, was he called it a story matrix. And basically his insight was salespeople in an organization, revenue generating professionals in an organization accumulate stories over time. Stories of client successes, client failures, lessons that they've learned, both in the sales and business development window, as well as in delivery. And those stories create pattern recognition, and those stories put meat on the bones in like a sales window. For example, when a client or a prospective client raises an objection, they have kind of a library of stories behind them that they've sort of accumulated over time that they deploy in service of overcoming that objection, or using an anecdote to make a point when they're trying to convince a client of a certain approach. But the problem is a lot of those stories are just resident in people's heads. And so his insight was, well, what if we could get those ideas out of their heads and onto paper and share that with the rest of the firm? And so he created this tool called a story matrix. It became the basis of that book. It also was the basis of a bunch of workshops that he facilitated for very large sales organizations around the country and around the world, and was ultimately instrumental in helping him land his job at Kellogg. And so, he exposed me to that 12 to 15 years ago, and I was enamored with this idea. Relatively straightforward, right? His is basically a table view, but I just thought that was really compelling. At Manifold, in my previous life at Manifold, on the tail end of my time there, we brought in some folks from BCG, PwC, that kind of thing, to try to professionalize our practice. We were starting to move upstream to enterprise. And if they knew me and if they'd taken a class at Kellogg and they kind of drank my Kool-Aid, my close rate was very high. But a lot of times we were in competitive bid situations and things like that against like the Deloitte Digitals of the world. And we were much less successful when we'd be head-to-head against them. And so we wanted to raise our profile, bring in some people who kind of knew what they were doing. We were startup guys by background and kind of were learning as we went. And so we brought in some very, very smart people. And one of the first things that we did is we started working on our own framework together. And we called it the Growth Innovators. And the first version of it was here. We had a proprietary data set that we had access to through a shared relationship with an organization called Valens that basically took public accounting data from public companies and normalized it so that you could make comparisons between them. And so we had a unique data set that was really advantageous for us. And we tried to codify it in a framework, and it was basically, how much are they investing in innovation? And then is it turning into incremental profit or return on assets and that kind of thing? And ultimately, is increasing the valuation of the business. And so this was our first version of it. It was kind of hard to explain and hard for people to wrap their heads around. I am a sports nerd, and there was a website at the time that there's a guy named Kirk Goldsberry, who had this very clever way of visualizing a shot chart. And it's something he became very, very well known for. And I really liked this idea. And I was thinking, like, is there a way that we could maybe visualize our framework a little bit more easily. And so we went to the kind of the standard like 2x2 that everybody, that you see kind of all over the place. It's probably the most common framework design. But we did kind of a Goldsberryan honeycomb kind of model. And what it allowed us to do was within any industry, we could grab the companies, plot them on this 2x2 kind of honeycomby sort of matrix. It's not perfectly precise, but it didn't really need to be. And this kind of became the basis for our growth innovators model. That was pretty successful in terms of generating top line awareness. It gave us a very natural way to start sales conversations, which I'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. But this was kind of a model that we found. And so I saw how effective this was. I saw how effective it was for Craig. I saw how at the best level, it becomes this thing that people teach in MBA programs and things like that. And so I've just been enamored with this idea of frameworks for a long time, and I've sort of become a collector of frameworks. And I think it's one of your more powerful tools in your toolkit. So that's what we're going to cover today, is how to make these. But first of all, how do I define these? I define a framework as a proprietary methodology informed by a clear point of view, organized and represented visually, designed to solve industry-specific programs in a differentiated way. So if we break that down, proprietary methodology just means it's something that's unique to us and that we own. It's taking the services that you may provide, product development, web design, digital marketing, strategy consulting, accounting, whatever. If we're being honest with ourselves, the services that we're providing are probably very similar, but our point of view is different. And so if we can take aspects of our point of view and translate that into a proprietary methodology, I think that's really, really valuable. It's informed by having a clear point of view, which means you know what your point of view is. As I mentioned in the beginning, that's one of the things that we often will help clients do. They have a lack of clarity around their point of view, or their point of view is vanilla or doesn't clearly and powerfully state what they do. And so that unlocks everything else that you're going to do, including the development of frameworks. Ideally organized and represented visually. It doesn't have to be represented visually, but I think that it's valuable to do it. I think it just makes it easier for people to remember and easier for people to work with. Designed to solve industry-specific problems. So every framework should be have a purpose and designed to solve something very specific. And ideally, it'd be something that's kind of specific to what it is that you're doing or the industry that you seek to serve. And then again, in a differentiated way, all of this kind of rolls up to that idea. It creates differentiation in the minds of our prospective customers, our prospective clients, people that we seek to serve. So everything's in service of that. So why are frameworks useful? I think there's a couple of reasons. One, I think most companies are disorganized and chaotic, and they're kind of winging it most of the time. So, meetings run long. They don't necessarily have a discernible purpose. There's no clear action steps. We don't know how to make decisions. We don't know what the problem even is that we're solving. We don't have a good process. And so we're kind of literally just making things up as we go. And as anybody who's ever felt imposter syndrome or whatever, when they're in a new role, they realize that they're doing something they've never done before. That's a lot of our work, honestly. A lot of knowledge work is doing things that we've never done before. And so frameworks actually provide, I think, a basis to kind of help solve for some of that. They bring focus and clarity, right, to situations. A good framework can focus everybody's thinking. It allows your team to avoid kind of drowning in the details or boiling the ocean and really focus on the most important things, right? And hone in on the questions that really, really matter. It's also great for providing a sense of direction. So it's almost like a sense of objectivity. It's like you use a framework and you're like, oh, these are the questions that we need to ask. And there's a certain sense in which that isn't universally true, right? Like you use a 2x2 or you use the McKinsey 7S or whatever it is. Is it universally true that those are the 7 questions that need to be asked, or the 7 lenses that we need to consider, or whatever it is? Probably not. But what it does is it clears up log jams and it provides a pathway to creating faster solutions, right? There are no necessarily perfect answers in business. It's much more of an art, I think, than a science in a lot of ways. But just the ability to make faster decisions and to provide like an objective third party point of view can also be really helpful, because otherwise you end up defaulting into politics and whoever has the loudest voice in the room and that kind of thing. And so I think it's really useful for people who are not the loudest voice in the room or the most powerful person in the room to make their cases much more persuasively and to get buy-in from other stakeholders and other team members, because you're appealing to this third-party framework that provides credibility that you might not necessarily have internally yourself. And so it's really valuable in that regard. They provide clients confidence as a result of that, right? So like, if they understand, if they are familiar with your framework and they deploy it, it gives people confidence that that they will be able to solve the problem because the framework has been implemented a bunch of times. If you're the person that they bring in, it signals a lot of credibility to you. Like, you are ideally positioned as the person to solve the problem, because if they buy into your framework, they buy into you as the originator of that framework, right? And so, and my wife is she's a chief revenue officer at an investment bank, and a pretty impressive executive team. But there have been 3 occasions in the last 2 years where the CEO of the organization read a book of some kind or was exposed to a framework of some kind. Bain has a concept of sales plays. There's a concept of question-based selling frameworks and things like that. On multiple occasions, he read a book, read a resource or whatever it was, bought into the premise of the framework, and then brought in the author or brought in the consultants to help them implement that framework. And so it's an ideal kind of positioning tool. And as a result of that, ultimately, it differentiates you as a firm. Like, if I believe in the framework, I believe in you. And as we'll see later on, it creates lots of opportunities for you to generate inbound interest. It gives you a rational reason to reach out that isn't annoying or spammy and is truly value added, which we'll talk about later. I think that the differentiation allows you to charge higher fees if you want to, because other people may do the same work that you do, but you're the only one that has the proprietary framework, right? And so it positions you as a trusted advisor that can justify potentially higher engagement fees as a result. Warren asks, is there more impact if someone anchors their new framework to a framework everyone already knows? It's a great question. I guess if you're just getting started, or if you're doing this internally, sure. And I guess if you are just getting started, if you wanted to say, hey, this is a riff or an adaptation of the BCG Matrix, we've modified it for our purposes because we've seen there are some tweaks that make it more useful for our particular industry or our particular use case. Yeah, I think that probably would be a good idea to kind of build off of or draft off of the credibility of an existing framework. I think that's a really good point. So yeah, I think that's definitely something you could try, especially if you're a smaller firm who doesn't necessarily have a reputation yet. So yeah, great question, Warren. So those are some of the reasons why I think frameworks are valuable. A couple types of frameworks just to think about, like organizationally, how can you think about this? And this is not exhaustive. I'm sure there are others, but these are some of the ones that I've encountered in the past. So the first one is problem frameworks that help us identify problems or figure out what the problem is. There's McKinsey's idea of MEIS, mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. This is Toyota's idea. I think it was Toyota originally. The idea of like the 5 whys exercise. So always asking, going 5 layers deep to try to figure out what the problem is. There's a bunch of stuff that can branch off of that. Like, you can identify solutions for each level of the 5. It helps you get to the root cause of a problem, that kind of thing. So problem frameworks. The second one is what we call ideation frameworks. So these are useful for facilitating brainstorming, facilitating opportunity identification exercises, that kind of thing. So a great example that I liked to use in my Manifold days, we did a lot of innovation consulting work, was this is from Doblin, which I believe was ultimately acquired by one of the bigger firms. I don't remember which one offhand, but Doblin had this idea of 10 types of innovation. When we think of innovation, we normally, there you go. Thank you, Deloitte. They were acquired by Deloitte. A lot of times when we think of innovation, we tend to think of like new products, but Doblin's insight was that there's actually a variety of ways that you can innovate. You can innovate on a business model. You can innovate on aspects of a product. You can innovate on the way that the product is delivered, the form factor of it. You can innovate on channel strategy. There's a bunch of different ways that you can innovate. And so They have decks that they've created that kind of spun off of this, where there's 10 or 12 questions or lenses you can ask within each one of these 10 elements. So very, very effective ideation framework. Process frameworks. So these are frameworks that help you figure out how to do something better. And one of my favorites is David Allen's GTD framework. This is his workflow for how to identify, clarify what all the like amorphous stuff that's going on in your life. So if you're familiar with GTD, it's getting things done. It's a framework that's very useful at a personal level for how do you manage all of the stuff that's kind of going on in your life. And so he created this workflow that helps you process your inbox of potential stuff and figuring out, is this actionable? If it is actionable, do I need to be the one to do it? Is it something that can be done in 2 minutes? He asks kind of a series of questions that allow you to figure out where this stuff needs to go so that you can organize your life much more effectively. There are heuristic frameworks. So heuristic frameworks are similar, I guess, the Doblin 10 types of innovation you could consider as part of this too, but any framework that just is kind of like lenses or hats that you put on to look at a problem from different facets, kind of like a prism. One of the ones that I used to use in my Manifold days for conversion optimization was the LIFT model. This was created by an organization called Wider Funnel. But it basically was like, if we're looking at a landing page, for example, and we're trying to improve the conversion rate of that landing page, these are 7 lenses I can look at. So the value proposition is the most important one, which is why it's the airplane. Basically, like, do we have a strong value prop? And then is the value prop clear, and is it relevant to me? Is there anything on the page that's creating distraction or anxiety that can decrease my thing? And then urgency is kind of jet fuel that can accelerate it, right? So those are just, you look at the page and you put on each one of those hats and you say, okay, is there anything that we're doing here to create urgency? Is there anything that we're doing here that's creating anxiety that we could remove? That kind of thing. One of our frameworks is the point of view framework. It's what we've been writing about. If any of you are subscribers to the Madison Playbook, we've been kind of going through this systematically, but I identified kind of 4 key pillars in a strong point of view. One is like, who do you seek to serve, your ideal client? What do you believe to be true? So your core beliefs, why you exist, your core values, and then your tone of voice. How do you communicate that? And so we walk through each one of those lenses and facilitate discussion around that. And then the last one is what I would call a paradigmatic framework. I don't know if that's a real word, but it's kind of like the overarching framework that you bring to bear in terms of what you do. A very famous one is EOS. It's the entrepreneurial operating system for anybody that's kind of in small business land. There's a whole universe of EOS implementers out there now that help organizations implement this. And it's basically a way to create a more scalable business where you can ultimately kind of replace yourself as the chief doer, right? And so it just is a great way to kind of create sanity, organization, let everybody know where they're going. So it's an overarching framework that kind of applies to your whole business, right? I think that you could think of our framework as kind of a version of that. Like, this is our comprehensive view of what we believe to be true for growing a boutique professional services firm. That would be another example, I think, of a paradigmatic framework. So I'm sure there are others that I'm not mentioning here, but those are some high-level ways of kind of thinking about it. So how do you go about designing it? This is our Madison's framework, like Inception, a little bit like nested dolls here. This is our framework for developing frameworks. We use the acronym ECLIPSE. It has 7 elements to it. And the first one is elements. So identify all of the components that are involved in your approach. And this is kind of again, a brainstorming exercise. The goal is, again, to identify, this is the McKinsey MEIS framework, identify what are some the mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive potential things that we could include in our framework. A great example of this from my buddy Mike Rome, who runs Moonwater, which is a fractional chief growth consultancy. This is his growth audit kind of approach. He has 8 questions that he asks, and everything is kind of designed around answering these 8 questions. And he believes that if you can answer these 8 questions well, that you will have an engine for sustainable and predictable growth inside of a startup. When you're starting out, you're going to have more, and you should have more than you will ultimately have. And so when we were kind of brainstorming what we believe to be true and kind of our paradigmatic framework for growing a professional services firm, these were some of the ideas that we came up with that we could theoretically focus on. But again, it's going to be really hard to design a framework that is easy to understand and memorable with this much stuff. And so now we have to do step 2, which is establish some criteria for which ones ultimately make it in our final framework. And some of the lenses that I like to use are relevance. Is it hyper relevant to my audience? Frequency. How often does this occur, or how applicable is it to to what percentage of our potential clients is this applicable for? So if it's applicable to 80%, that's probably better than if it's only applicable to 20%, right? Agency. Is this actually something I can influence or not? So there might be aspects that you brainstormed that, if you're really honest about it, either your client doesn't have the ability to make a difference with, or that you don't have an ability as their consultant to make a difference with. And so if it's not something you can actually improve upon through your engagements, you probably don't want to include it. What would the impact be of it? So not all levers are equal. There are some levers that probably have a disproportionate impact. And so can you identify what some of those might be? And then subordination. This isn't a reason to not include something, but it's more of like a grouping mechanism, and we'll get into more detail about that in a little bit. But some of these are actually like subsets of something, right? And so in our example here, there were some things that we removed, right? Acquiring firms. Not every boutique firm is in a position to do that or is interested in that strategically. Upselling is probably a function of, like, what's the breadth of service offerings, and does one service offering lead to another? That's another one that, isn't necessarily relevant to everybody. Some of these we candidly don't have a lot of agency to help our clients with, and so we removed some of those. And then some of them, I think, we can group into other things or subordinate to other things. So identify some some criteria for which ones kind of make it into, try to avoid boiling the ocean and kind of whittle things down a little bit. Number 3, use clear and memorable labels. So how can we help people quickly understand what these things are? And so you can, sorry, real quick, Michael, I notice you don't have uniqueness here. That you have a unique skill or angle to help customers. How do I answer that? I think part of that is I think the framework itself, in a way, is like a way of arriving at that. To your point, though, that may, if you already know you have a very clear approach for doing this, and you already know what that is, these are the 3 things that we do that are different than everybody else, then you probably have already done the work of steps 1 and 2 in terms of identifying what should be included in the framework. And now it's more a function of, all right, well, how do we name these things in a compelling way? How do we visually represent them in a compelling way? But it probably gets you already there. So I don't know if that answers that or not. I think in a lot of cases, firms don't really have as clear of differentiation as they think there. They don't necessarily have quite as unique of an angle as they think. And so this can be a way, if you feel like you lack clear differentiation, of at least taking elements that are relatively consistent and codifying them in a way that makes sense. So, like, for example, like, that McKinsey 7S framework, I think, is a really good example of this. Like, all they're really doing is taking like 7 pretty high level elements of a business and kind of visually representing them in a way and saying, these are the 7. And they probably aren't the 7, but they probably are there's probably like 12 or 13. I don't know why they picked those specific ones. But similarly, like with a lot of the 2x2 matrices, like you'll see in a lot of consulting decks, sometimes there's a sense of arbitrariness to why they selected those 2 dimensions, I think, in a lot of cases. But just the exercise of kind of picking those 2 dimensions, it's like, there's just some inherent credibility that comes to it of like, oh yeah, these are the 2, right? And so I think that doing this process, if you don't have a clear proprietary methodology already, is a way for you to take what is otherwise a relatively commodified service offering and turn it into something that has the appearance of being a little bit more proprietary. But yeah, if you already have a very, very clear angle or approach on how you do it, then, by all means, maybe you don't necessarily need to do that whole brainstorming step. You've probably already done that work. And now it's just about making it clear and easy to understand and representing it visually. So I don't know if that answers that or not, but step 3, use clear and memorable labels. And so again, I think this is just like looking at each one of those things and asking yourself, I'm a big believer. I had a mentor that used to say that words are sledgehammers. And so words have a lot of power to them. And that manifests itself in a lot of ways in terms of what we do. One of the things that we do when we do the point of view workshop with clients is we turn it into what we call a manifesto. And it's really just a document. It's primarily for internal purposes for us to make sure that we understand and have clarified what it is that they're trying to do in a clear and compelling way. But in some cases, it's actually a really useful marketing tool too, because it can be we try to express what they believe to be true about the world in language that's as compelling as possible, and it can be useful both as a marketing tool and also as a recruiting tool as well. People like to be a part of a cause or believe that what they're doing matters, and so it can be really useful in that way. But all of which is to say, like, I'm a big believer in the power of words, and so I try to take simple language and communicate it in more powerful ways. And so some examples of some of that, with some of those aspects that you saw in just that chart there, like we talked about. We reframed content as authority marketing, right? Like it's effectively, it's content that positions you as an authority in the minds of the people that you seek to serve. I mentioned the manifesto document. Trusted advisor, which people are probably familiar with. David Meister was kind of the grandfather of the professional services firm literature. Wrote The Trusted Advisor, wrote How to Manage a Professional Services Firm. But trusted advisors are really strong. Rather than I'm a consultant, a trusted advisor kind of signals certain things. Slightly famous is kind of this idea of you don't need to have 10,000 followers or 100,000 followers or 1 million followers in our domain. You just need to have, it could be 100 followers or 500 followers or 1,000 followers, but if they're the right people, then you can build a very successful business on the back of that. And so our goal is not to make you an influencer. Our goal is to make you slightly famous among the people that you seek to serve. And then just, perfect proposals, systematic referrals, that kind of thing. So how can we attach stronger language to the elements that made it in there? Step 4, map the interactions. So the elements might have some relationships with each other, and that'll inform the ultimate visual representation of it, right? And so you could have causal relationships where this one leads to this one, or this one is dependent on this one, right? We already talked a little bit about hierarchy, but like some of these might be subordinate to others or elements of the larger one. So there might be some sort of categorization structure you can employ. How do they flow? Sometimes, you can flow from one thing to the other. Sometimes you can have almost like a cyclical kind of relationship. So how do these elements kind of relate to each other? So in our example, we narrowed them down. We realized there was kind of a cyclical nature to it. And we kind of bucket them into these kinds of things happen first, and then these kinds of things happen second, and then these kinds of things happen third, and then these happen fourth. And on the basis of referrals and doing great work, we kind of start the engine over again, right? And so that was kind of how we went about doing that. But figure out how the elements kind of interact with each other. Step 5, create your pillars. Can we further summarize things to make it easier to navigate? Can we create some overarching terminology that just give us some simple mental hooks? And so like in our case, again, we did attract, convert, deliver. So all of these kind of rolled up to, we realized, going back to this one, that these two really are both underneath this kind of attract piece. And so that allowed us to simplify it further into kind of 3 high-level elements. And then we tried to do that even more in terms of like how do these kind of roll up to each other as well? And that was kind of how we arrived at our 3-3-3. I just like, there's a symmetry to it that I kind of liked. You don't have to have symmetry, but I think it can be really helpful. And so that's how we kind of narrowed down into those 3. Design a schema is step 6. So this is basically how do you visualize it, right? At the end of the day, you're dealing with pretty simple tools here. You got lines and some basic shapes. Most frameworks are basically basic shapes. And so now that we know what our categories are, what our pillars are, how they interact with each other and how they flow, we can start to try to brainstorm. And I just recommend like sketching these things out and just trying different approaches, like on paper, right? You can sketch a bunch of different ideas really, really quickly. Don't get too precious with the form factor or the fidelity of the design when you're just kind of ideating how you might visually represent it. But just some examples to get your brain thinking. We've already talked about the 2x2. This is an example. This is called the Anzoff Matrix, which basically kind of helps organizations decide on their product and market strategy. And you can see they just added a little element here where there's like increased risk on both sides, existing versus new products, and then existing versus new markets. That was how they kind of identified the 2x2 there. So 2x2 is one that everybody is familiar with it. Everybody recognizes it. It's easy to leverage. A slightly different flavor of it is sort of a 2x2 where there's a positive and a negative dimension, right? So this is called the Kano model. We used it a lot at Manifold for helping make product decisions. And the idea was there are certain kind of features that are called must-have features or table stakes features, where if it's not in the product, people are pretty upset. It needs to be able to do that thing. But if it's there, they're not like thrilled about it, right? So what are your table stakes features? These are your performance features. These are the ones that are where your kind of differentiation lies. So if we do this better than everybody else, people are going to be really, really happy. And they're unhappy. Like, we identified that this is the opportunity that's missing that our product can solve for. And so we're going to go all in on that, right? And then there are delighter features, which are things that the client or the customer isn't even expecting. But if you can do it, they are delighted. And that can generate word of mouth and create greater retention, that kind of thing. So this is an example of similar to a 2x2. There's two dimensions to it, but there's a positive aspect to it and a negative aspect to it. Another example, this is called the 3 horizons of focus. This is something that we used for creating portfolios of innovation for our clients back in my Manifold days. And it basically is like, there's 3 horizons, and you can think about it from a time horizon. You can think about it from a risk horizon. There's a bunch of ways of doing it. And the basic idea is, when you're doing ideation, you want to try to make sure that you've got ideas kind of represented across all 3 stages, and you want to decide on what percentage of resources you're choosing to allocate across all 3 phases. And so, like, we talked a lot about like 70% here, 30% over here, that kind of thing. But it's just a simple way of visualizing that. Another one that we used was just a triangle. This is called R, or startup metrics for pirates. It's acquisition, activation, retention, revenue, and referral. And so we just visualized that to Warren's point earlier. This is a framework from Dave McClure that we just basically turned into a triangle to kind of visualize it and make it easier for clients to understand. This is the build, measure, learn loop. So if you have a kind of a loop-based model, this is a way of visually representing that. This is from Eric Ries, the build, measure, learn loop from Lean Startup parlance. And it had, there's 3 activities, and then there are kind of exhaust from that. So like, we learn stuff that generates ideas. We build those ideas into our product. We measure them and use the data to kind of inform our new ideas, and so on and so on. You can turn flowcharts into a framework. So this is the VRIO matrix, which helps evaluate internal resources in an organization in terms of competitive advantage. And so it's sort of like a series of yes or no questions that hopefully get you to a place where you have a durable competitive advantage. So, but if you have like a flowchart or a series of questions, like, you can kind of like the GTD framework that we talked about earlier too, you can represent that visually. This is Cotter's 8-step change model. So, I mean, this is a way of taking just like, if you don't have any other ideas and it goes linearly, this is a clever way of visualizing that. And you can see here kind of like they just are steps that build on top of each other. So every step is kind of dependent on the one that precedes it. And then he, organizes it visually into kind of 3 high-level categories. And you can use tools like color or categorization over here, things like that, to make that easier to understand. Another example of a lens framework or a heuristic framework. This is the startup canvas. So really, the idea here is that a startup is just a series of guesses. You have a guess that a particular customer has a particular type of problem, and that you're the solution to that problem, and then you can solve it in a differentiated way that's unique, and that you can acquire enough customers to make a viable business, and that the cost of doing it relative to the revenue is worth it, right? And these are all guesses. And so what you do is you basically go through it and you write down what all of your assumptions are. And then this is a framework, like on a simple single page. The idea is that I now have an approach for testing these ideas over time and de-risking my business by de-risking the respective hypotheses kind of underneath it. So those are just some examples of ways of visualizing something. Hopefully that can get you thinking. But again, you notice like it's boxes and shapes and lines is really all it is. And so The questions around what type of framework it is, whether there are dependencies, how they flow with each other, all of that kind of thing answers or can inform what type you end up using. And again, this is kind of how we ended up using ours is I did a triangle, honestly, for just visual interest. It has 3 main pillars. There are 3 pillars underneath each pillar. And it is it's like vaguely cyclical in the sense that like referrals lead back here, but you know, I might be able to make that a little clearer. Which gets to my last point, actually, good segue. Step 7 is evolve over time. So your first version of this is not going to be perfect. So you want to test it on engagements. You want to iterate on it and improve as you learn. And a couple of lenses you can use here to think about this. Flexibility. So like how applicable is this? How can it be adapted for different contexts? Does it scale up and down well? Is it as useful for a small project as it is for a comprehensive project? Like figure out what the constraints are around it. It doesn't mean that you don't use it anymore. If, for example, there are some constraints in where it's more applicable versus less applicable. But that's good to know, and that informs when you deploy it or not. Like you can think of frameworks almost like a toolkit, right? Some tools have very broad applicability and are kind of always relevant. Some tools have more limited use cases, and so you want to have a little more judicious about when you deploy them. And you only learn that by actually, you know, using them, right? Another one is modularity. So can you design, for anybody that this probably dates me, but Voltron, you know, how modular are these? Can you break them into components, and can those components be used independently? So an example for us is that point of view. The point of view is an element of our comprehensive framework that has its own framework within it, right? So like there are modules that you can break out. Same with the framework, the Eclipse model. Like it is our framework for making frameworks, and it is part of our larger framework. So can you create sort of a series of these that can, again, I think, create further differentiation for you? Not only do you have a proprietary paradigmatic approach, but you also have proprietary heuristic frameworks or process frameworks or things like that kind of within it. I think another great example of that, like getting back to EOS, like EOS not only has a paradigmatic framework, but within it, the different elements have their own, I would consider to be frameworks as well. Like they have frameworks for how you run meetings. They have frameworks for how you determine like a 10-year vision, 3-year vision, that kind of thing. So you can create frameworks within frameworks and make them more modular over time. Practicality. So focus on how each of these elements, how easy it is to actually implement them. So a good example would be, do we actually have the tools to make this helpful and useful? There are sometimes, I think there are frameworks that in theory are a good idea, but in actuality, you can't get the data that you need, or you can't get the questions answered that you need. You can't get the inputs that you need to actually implement that framework well. And going back to the Growth Innovators framework, the only reason we were able to actually do that Growth Innovators framework was because we had access to a proprietary data model that allowed us to generate those things really quickly with a high degree of accuracy. Otherwise, you're just sort of like making it up. So it gave us credibility. If we had to get that data manually from our clients, I don't think we would have used it, because it would have been too much work. They would have had to be very transparent with us about the financials of their business, when candidly we hadn't earned the right to do that yet, right? And we weren't a McKinsey, so the odds are Xerox wasn't going to give us sufficient visibility. So like, so, you know, how easy is it to get access to the data, or to get the inputs that you need to actually implement the framework is another consideration to keep in mind. And as I mentioned, this is iterative. Like we want to create it's unlikely that your first diagram or your first approach is going to be perfect. And so you want to leave space, hold it loosely, right? Like strong ideas loosely held. You want to hold space for you to be able to iterate and improve on your framework over time. And that's totally okay. And recognize like the limitations of it. Again, all models are wrong. Some are useful. Like there's a certain sense in which these are tools to help you serve your clients better, right? And I think that you can go into it in client engagements with a little bit of humility even, and say, you know what, like this is a way of thinking about this, right? Like especially early on when you're trying to validate the efficacy of it, like you can hold it a little bit loosely and say, we've seen this work for ourselves. We've seen this work for some other people. Candidly, you know, like it isn't universally applicable at all times, but this is a tool that you can try on and let's just see how it works. And if we reach a dead end, we reach a dead end. But You know, which is one reason why like I'm a big believer in collecting frameworks as well. So like not every framework that you deploy as a consultant in service of your clients needs to be one that you've created yourself. But ideally, you do have at least one that you do, because that, it's a very effective kind of marketing tool and awareness tool, as we've talked about. What was my point here? Who cares? We'll skip that. How do you use your framework? So one of the things I love about these frameworks is that they're applicable for all three phases of the attract, convert, deliver kind of journey. And so one of the things that you learn is as you use the framework and as you implement it, you learn there's lots of nuances to it over time. And so this is an example again from Kirk Goldsberry. He took this one idea and he kept implementing it in a bunch of different ways. And so showing one version from a particular period of time, and then showing another version for a different period of time. And then not just showing one player, but showing aggregate, right? He did this for Steph Curry, where he visualized it slightly differently, but it was all of his shooting from his entire career. He played with form factor, and he made it dual dimensions, where like the size of the dot represented frequency and then the color of the dot represented efficacy, right? So like he started to iterate and play around with it in a lot of different ways. As we dug into ours, we realized that we could do similar things. And so not only could we take all of the data set, like the complete data set that we had, we could do this by industry. And so that allowed us to create top of the funnel content around vignettes, right? So like this was an example, kind of like Jim Collins with Good to Great, where he identifies these exemplars of companies who back up his ideas, like in Good to Great and some of those other books. He always chose like 7 or 8 companies that ideally reflect one of the principles, right? We realized we could do the same thing. And so we went industry by industry and wrote these little vignettes. Like this is an example for Tyson Foods, where we showed them kind of relative to their peers. Another example, we realized that we could do the same Kirk Goldsberryan thing, where we reflected it over time. So we could show a company and how they looked between years, like how did they move through the growth innovators matrix. So as you use it more, the point is it creates almost an inexhaustible supply of ideas that you can then write about, that kind of all roll up into your high level framework. And it just gives you a lot of opportunities to kind of reinforce this idea in the minds of your prospective clients. It's also really useful in terms of converting. So, right, talked about like workshops and webinars like this one. So, right, like we created a series of workshops kind of around the growth innovators idea, and how do you actually go about what do you do with it? Like once you know what quadrant you're in, what do you actually do? So we created a series of webinars around that, brought in some guest speakers from exemplar companies to kind of help represent that well. It also gave us a fantastic way to do outbound that was respectful and thoughtful. So one of my beliefs is that you probably get hit up on LinkedIn often with people in your DMs about like, would you like 5 to 10 more leads every single month? And it's usually like some 25-year-old who, like in my, like just isn't going to represent my brand well. All right. And so there is a way to do outbound that is kind of, in my opinion, spammy and disrespectful, and I think creates brand risk. There are ways to do it that are really thoughtful, and hyper personalized, hyper relevant is a great way to do it. And so this example, because we had data on all of these public companies normalized, we could run an analysis on any company that we wanted to, that we had data for. And then we could reach out, and we knew who our ideal buyer was. We could reach out to them and say, hey, here's our white paper on the Growth Innovators Matrix. Would you like a custom analysis for you? Or we could even do it where we just gave it to them in general, where we just said, hey, we benchmarked you relative to your competitive set on these 4, and bucketed you into one of the 4 quadrants. We'd love to walk you through what the results were, which piques their curiosity. It's hyper relevant to them. And then what do you do about it? And once we got in those meetings, like we had some very natural on-ramps for what you do based on which quadrant that you're in, right? And so it was a very natural transition into business development conversations that created leads and created opportunities for us as a business. Another good example, I mentioned my buddy Mike at Moonwater. He does this through gating his content and creates kind of a similar to the Madison playbook. He's created a curriculum on how you implement his 8 questions and does a deep dive on each one of those. And he gates it behind a name and an email, but he's giving you a whole lot of value. Like he's giving you the exact process that he uses to go through those 8 questions, and shows you examples, with a very soft call to action at the end on what you do about it. And then it naturally leads into deliver in terms of the actual work itself. Ideally, your framework isn't just something that you use as a marketing gimmick, but it's actually informs how you deliver your work in a differentiated way to your clients. And so, again, to use Mike's example, his 8 questions lead into a growth audit. That's always how he starts an engagement, is with a growth audit. He does a deep dive into all 8 of those questions and tries to answer it for his clients. And then that turns into a larger engagement, right? And so how can you do that for yourself as well? So that's frameworks. Proprietary, again, to sum up, a proprietary methodology informed by a clear point of view, organized and represented visually, ideally, designed to solve industry-specific problems in a differentiated way. I know we went through a ton of material there. Any questions that you have that I can answer for you with the time that we have remaining? Warren, several years ago, a coworker took my framework and claimed it as his own in a book. How do I protect my new framework? You're out of my depth here. I would talk to an IP attorney on how you protect it and what aspects of it are protectable or not. I would assume that there's some trademark protection or patent protection that you can do. I would, if this person was a coworker, that's probably tricky. Like if you're the business owner, employees that work for you, that would probably fall under your kind of intellectual property clause as part of your employment agreement, right? And so that's easier to deal with. If it was a framework that you created that your company didn't create, and that for some reason your company did not own because they didn't do their job, then I'm not entirely sure how you'd solve for that. But in terms of like the higher level thing, like I would rather have a framework that other people riff on or copy than not have a framework, would be how I would think about it at a high level. That is probably the worst case scenario, what you mentioned there, in terms of them like taking it and passing it off as their own and becoming successful on your work. So I mean, I guess I would talk to, if you truly believe it's valuable, if you're the business owner, it's probably protected through your IP. If you're not the business owner, I would probably go and try to protect it, right? And so that would probably be my answer, but I think an intellectual property attorney would probably be your best bet there. But for the record too, I would also say, like, if other people use my framework and give me credit, especially, like, that's a win, right? That's actually the ideal end state. Like we talked about, when universities start to teach your framework as part of their curriculum, like that's how you know you've truly made it. But I mentioned the wider funnel framework. That's a framework that conversion optimization firm did. Every time I mention it, or every time anybody else mentions it, I'm implicitly kind of giving them credibility and giving them an opportunity, potentially for new business. Like some people might work with me because they think that framework's cool and I know how to implement it. But I bet a lot of people are like, I'm going to just go to the source and I'm going to go work with the person who created it because they're the best in the world at it. So, other questions? It was so comprehensive and well done, and I was riveted the entire time. I have no questions. You've answered all. No, here we go, Kenneth. I've developed a framework and found a lot in your presentation that resonates. How do you work with people to refine their approaches? So that's a good segue. Just how we work generally. So I'll clarify this. The way that we generally work with clients, right? And this is today. I have a longer term. There's a longer term vision for what Madison does. These days, what it looks like is we help you get clarity on your point of view if you don't already have one. If you do already have one, it's more of just a knowledge transfer to us. But there's usually areas for incremental improvement there. If you don't have a framework, just as part of our engagements, we'll look for opportunities to try to codify that if we can. And then each month, we focus a lot of our work on the authority marketing piece. So how do we communicate your point of view and communicate your framework well? And so we get on a call with you each month. We kind of do a brain dump with you or your partners or managing directors or your revenue generating professionals, and just kind of riff together. And it's pretty fun, actually. It's part of, I think, what makes us unique is just we're not a 25-year-old marketing associate. We actually understand your world and understand your domain. And so we can have conversation kind of as peers. So it's very fun. And then you go back and you do your job, and a week later you get a month's worth of content that is, again, primarily short form. We have reasons for that we can talk about, offline. And then we then design a series of webinars, usually 4, try to do it quarterly because I don't want you constantly in sell mode. But we try to do those in ways that I address the key pain points of your customer such that they want to raise their hand and learn more, basically. So that's how we do it. The framework is kind of a subset of point of view. It's not always applicable to everybody. Not everybody already has it, but if it is something that you have, that's just something that we'll create kind of together as we go through it as part of the larger engagement. So I don't know if that answers that enough for you. Jason, your branding and presentation style incredible. Thank you. One of our values is craft. And so I think if anybody has seen that post, we try to pay a lot of attention to deliverable quality. John asks, general take on EOS. I think it's a great, I think for a lot of organizations, it's fantastic. There's a lot in there to like. The other framework that's pretty common is the scaling up framework. I don't remember what exactly he calls it. I found that one to be a little bit more complex, harder to understand. I really like the simplicity of EOS. And a lot of organizations, I think especially, this is a conversation for another time, but if your long-term ambitions are to sell your firm, whether that's a services business or a consulting firm, and if that's a conversation you want to have at some point, we never sold Manifold, but I had a lot of conversations with investment bankers around it and what that process looks like. And I have friends who've sold theirs, and I've seen that process. One of the key things from a services standpoint is key person risk and lack of documented systems. And so EOS is great at not just creating clarity for the organization about where you're going, but it's really good about creating a series of internal processes that allow you to kind of systematize your business and can eliminate a lot of the key person risk stuff. So I think EOS is fantastic. I think a lot of it is like a riff on Michael Gerber. If you're familiar with Michael Gerber, who wrote the E-Myth back in the early 80s, I think EOS is kind of maybe a more concrete, actionable take on some of the E-Myth methodology. But yeah, I generally think EOS is pretty great. What advice would you have for the 25-year-old? I'm not spamming people now, but I'm curious what my takeaway should be without a ton of experience using frameworks with clients. For those of us who got stuck in meetings, recording available. Yeah, the recording will be available afterwards. Peter, you're a 25-year-old. So I was a collector of frameworks before I was a designer of frameworks. And so you saw a bunch of those examples. And if you send me a DM after this, I have a Notion document I can share with you with some of my favorites that I have just sort of collected over time, and how you can go about using them. I think that's a really good way to learn, is to become a student of them and a collector of them. And so you can then deploy them in your organ. I'm assuming when you say you're a 25-year-old, that means that you're not the owner of your own business, in which case you're doing this in service of your team and on internal engagements. And again, I think it's a really good way to demonstrate a whole bunch of things as an employee, that you're a reader, that you're a strategic thinker, you're using these frameworks to advocate for your ideas in a more compelling way. And I think it'll earn you a lot of credibility internally. And then, through the act of using them, you learn what some of the nuances are and what works and what doesn't. And over time, you can design them. If you have enough of an understanding of your business, I think that's another huge way to really look like an A player, is if you took a stab at this and you just codified it, and maybe you just share it with your manager and just say, hey, listen, I take whatever you want from this, but I thought this would be a cool way of representing this. I've seen clients sometimes get confused when we try to talk about our methodology. I tried to visualize it for us. Would love your thoughts. That's a way to kind of demonstrate, again, initiative and resourcefulness and intelligence and a whole bunch of things. So I have to leave in the hour. Thank you. Yeah. So anybody that needs to bump off, you can. I can hang out though if you do have questions. And then also, if you have questions after this, I'll send. I'm going to send the recording out. But feel free to DM me. I'm happy to riff on this stuff with you more after this as well. But if anybody else has questions while we're here, drop them in the chat. Okay. Looks like no other questions. Appreciate you all for being here. We're right at the hour. Hopefully, I'll give you the rest of your day back. Hopefully, I was respectful of your time. Good use of your time. Again, if you have feedback on how I can do better for the next one, let me know. I'm all ears. And again, if you want to riff, just send me a DM or you can email me, Sean at hiremadison.com. But really appreciate you having you here. And best of luck building your own frameworks. Talk to you. Hopefully, we'll see you at your next one. Take care, everybody.